What's going on, guys? Welcome back. Hope you're doing well. In this module, we're going to be talking about optionals. So we're going to go over a definition, go through some real life examples of what optionals look like, and then we're going to hop into the code and start working with them. So let's take a look at our definition here. So an optional value allows us to code more safely when working with properties that may or may not have a value. So what exactly does that mean? Well, let's take a look at this example here. So I'm sure at some point you guys have all filled out some sort of form that looks like this, where one of these fields is going to be optional. We see down here that this phone number field is optional. That means you can either enter a value in there or you can leave it completely blank. So let's talk about what that's going to look like programmatically. So all of these fields here, first name, last name, email, we are, just stating that they're going to be strings. So whatever the user were to type into this field would get stored in this first name property, and then I could use it however I want to. And when I get all the way down to phone number, we see that this is different because it has a question mark next to it. So in Swift, this is how we denote that a property is going to be optional. So it has one of two potential states. It might have a value, and that value could be a string, or it might not have a value at all. So the value would be nothing. And in programming, we refer to that as nil. So next up, what we're going to do is hop into the code, guys, and start working with optionals, see the type of situations where we're going to want to use them, and see why they're really beneficial and helpful for us when we're writing apps and computer programs. So let's go ahead and jump into Xcode now. All right, guys, so with Xcode opened up, let's go ahead and create another playground. So going to go up there and we're going to create a new file. As always, it's just going to be a blank playground, and we are going to call this optionals. Okay, so let's just delete this stuff really quickly. And let me paste my notes in for this module. And once again, you guys should pause the video and type that stuff out for your future reference. But what I want us to do is start off with an example of when you might use an optional property in a real life application. So I've built this Instagram clone, and this is something we're going to be building in the app development courses. And what I want us to talk about is this user bio property. So if you guys have ever used Instagram before, you probably know that entering a bio is optional. Entering a profile image is also optional, right? So the concept here is that these things may or may not have a value. A user might have a bio, they might not. They might have a profile picture, they might not, right? So if they do, it's going to show up there. And if they don't, if we go to Spider-Man's profile, we'll see that he doesn't have a profile picture and he doesn't have a bio. So he chose not to fill those fields out, so they don't display in the application. So this is the concept of when you're going to want to use optional properties. So we're going to go ahead and mimic this example in our code with an example right now. So let's go ahead and hop into Xcode here, and we're going to create a couple properties. We're going to create one for like username, and we can call it Batman. And then we're going to create another property called bio. So we're going to say var bio. You're going to put a colon there. We're going to state that it needs to be a string. And then you're going to put a question mark after it. And as we talked about in the presentation, this means that this is going to be an optional property. So as we see in our notes, it could have one of two potential states. It can either contain a value or be nil or nothing, right? So if the user ever chooses to enter a bio, then it'll have a value. But if not, nothing will be there. So this is how we sort of safely deal with properties that may or may not have a value. Okay, so let's go ahead and write a function here that's called getUserInfo. And it's just going to print out our user's information to us. So let's print out our username. And then let's see what happens if we try to print out the bio. And let's go down here and call our function getUserInfo and just hit play to run that. Okay, so username is Batman, and we see that bio is nil, guys. And then we get this error, or sorry, it's just a warning, but don't really worry about that for now. What I want us to do now is go ahead and actually supply this bio property with a value now. So if you guys remember, in order to do that, to mutate a variable, we just access it like this, and then we use our assignment operator, our equal sign, and we give it a value. So now I can say Dark Knight or something like that, right? And then let's call our getUserInfo function again. So This sort of goes back to our functions module, right, guys, where we don't want to have to retype these 2 lines of code every time we want to do this. So we're just wrapping it inside of a function, and then we can reuse that function anywhere we want. So what's going to happen here is when I run this, now my bio is going to have a value. So we should get something different back from our function call. And that's exactly what we see, right? The second time we call this function, because we gave bio a value on line 21 and then call the function again, it's going to print out our bio. But you guys see that it is sort of wrapped with this optional wrapper right here. So we see optional, and then it's sort of wrapped inside of these parentheses. So I want to just give you guys a quick analogy that's going to really explain this concept here. So let's imagine that this bio variable is like a container, right? That's what variables essentially are, as we talked about in the first module. They're containers, or like boxes that store values or information, right? So let's think of this as a literal box or container. And when we open that box, it may or may not have something inside of it, right? It could be nothing, or it could be a string. And if we want to use that property and actually work with it, we have to extract it from that box or pull it out of there before we can use it, right? So the first time we call the function, there's nothing in the box. The second time we call the function, we open up the box and say, hey, there's something in there, but we need to pull it out of that box before we can use it. And this concept is known as unwrapping something in Swift. So we want to unwrap this optional so that we can use it safely. And I'll go over what I mean by safely in a little bit. I just want to go over how to start working with these optionals and unwrapping them, guys. So in our get user info function, I'm going to add some comments here. This is unwrapping our optional and extracting the value. So this is one way of doing it. We're going to go over multiple ways of doing it. So we're going to say if let unwrapped bio equals bio, print user bio unwrapped is, and then do your string interpolation with the unwrapped bio. So I'll explain what this means in just a second. Let's just go ahead and run our code again. Okay, so the first time, let me actually just add a divider here so we can distinguish between the function calls. So go ahead and just add like a divider at the end of your function. So every time it calls, it'll, sort of split up the calls in our console just like that. Awesome. So the first time we call it, we get these 2 lines of code, but we notice that this if let statement never executes, right? We don't ever hit line 23 in the first time. But the second time we get username is Batman, bio is optional, Dark Knight. But then we notice the third line of code is really interesting, right? We see user bio unwrapped is Dark Knight. And this is ultimately how we would want to use this stuff. We don't want this nasty optional property wrapper there. We want our property to be unwrapped so that we can see it as a plain string like that. So let's break this if let statement down really quickly, because this is something that a lot of beginner programmers get confused with. I was really confused with this concept when I was teaching myself how to code. So I want to break it down for you guys. So we're saying like, hey, if the bio property has a value, then we want to store it in this property right here. So we say, basically we're saying if bio exists, store that value in this unwrapped bio property. And that unwrapped bio guy will not have this optional wrapper here, because we are basically safely checking to see if bio has a value. And if it does, we store that string that we want to use, that we want to pull out of the box, and we're storing it in this property here. So we're basically saying if we let unwrapped bio equal to bio, then we can safely use that property. So what exactly do I mean by safely here? What's the logic behind that? Well, you can imagine that things might get messy if you try to use this value and it's not there, right? So in your program or your app or whatever, if you're saying like, hey, use this property and let's assume it's there, but for some reason it's not, it could cause your program to crash. So essentially what this if let statement does is it gives us a safer way of using that optional property, right? Because if and only if this has a value, will this if block execute. So we're only going to go down this path if bio has a value. And we can see that situation in the first function call where bio doesn't have a value at that point. bio only has a value as of line 31. Everything else before bio is nil, right? So we don't ever go down this path because bio is empty. It's nil at that point. And then we do end up going down that path, and then we can safely use that property via this unwrap method with an if let statement once bio does have a value. So this gives you, like I said, just a way of being able to safely use these optional properties. And we're going to go over a couple other ways of using or unwrapping optionals. The next one being the unsafe way of doing things. So this is where you might run into trouble with your program. And this is typically something you should never do, but it is an option for certain scenarios. And I'm going to show you how this could cause your program to crash. So Swift has something called a force unwrap. So basically, guys, if you go up here and just put an exclamation point after your bio property, this is going to tell your compiler to, hey, unwrap this thing no matter what. I'm not going to be safe here. I just need you to use this thing. Whether it has a value or not, I don't care. Force unwrap it, right? And like I said, there is a time and place for this, but typically you want to avoid this at all costs, because if we run our code here, the first time we call this function, it's going to try to force unwrap that bio property, and there's going to be nothing there. So this will cause your program to crash. So we're going to run that. And we notice here that in the first function call, we get some really convoluted error here. But if you look at the console, we see fatal error, unexpectedly found nil, while unwrapping an optional value. So this is a big no-no, okay? So I'm just going to add a comment here. Can use exclamation point to force unwrap, but this will cause crash. Okay, so that's, like I said, typically something you never want to do. But let's go over a situation in which it would be okay to do that, but we'll see why the if let way is better. So I could say if bio is not equal to nil, then we could say print bio unwrapped is bio. And use your exclamation point there to force unwrap it. And guys, if we run this again, we'll notice that we don't get a crash, okay? And that's because basically we're doing almost the same thing this if let statement is doing it. We're just doing it slightly different, right? So we're basically checking, hey, if bio is not equal to nil, then we can force unwrap it, because in this case, we know that bio will have a value because it's not equal to nil, right? So we can see here that this guy hits on line 27 in our second function call, bio unwrapped is dark night. And we're using that force unwrap, but the only reason we can use it safely there is because we initially checked to see if bio was equal to nil or not. So that's basically what the if let statement is doing. It's just doing it in a cleaner way, right? We're saying like, hey, if bio has a value, store it in this property. Or another way of saying that is if we let unwrapped bio equal bio, then we can safely use it inside of that if block. It's essentially, like I said, doing the same thing as this, just in a cleaner way. So we don't have to use this nasty force unwrapping and all of that stuff. And another note, guys, is you can name that property there whatever you want. I just named it unwrapped bio to sort of make things clear to you, and which property is which. This is referring to our bio guy. And a quick trick in Xcode that I don't think I've let you guys know about up until this point is if you just click on a property name, it will highlight everywhere that property is being used. So like if I just go hover over bio, I can see that this is referring to my bio up here, and that's being used right there and right there and right there. And if you guys hover over this if let property, right, you can see that I'm using that inside of this guy right here, inside of this if block. So it is important to note that you can name this property whatever you want. I could call it X, right? I could even call it, and this does get a little confusing for some people, I could even call it bio. And you guys might be like, hey, I thought you said you can't duplicate variable names, but because this is within an if let statement, it's okay. And I know that might be confusing for now, so don't really worry about that. But like I said, we'll get tons more practice with this stuff as we go. Next up, guys, I just want to work with another example to show you some other ways of how we can unwrap optionals. So let's go ahead and make another section here, guys. We're going to make a mark, and we're going to call this one default values. So Another way of unwrapping an optional is supplying it with a default value if the optional property isn't there or if it's nil. So what exactly is that going to look like? Well, we're going to do an example here where imagine we're filling out this form and we have a first name and a last name property, and we are going to add in like a middle name guy. And that's almost always optional when you fill out these types of forms. And then we're going to try to build a full name out of all of that stuff. So we're going to try to combine all of those names from those fields and see if we can produce a full name for the user. So let's go ahead and go back to our code here. And we're going to create a variable for our first name, John, var middle name. And this is going to be an optional string because it may or may not be there. The user has the option of whether or not they want to enter their middle name in this form. And then we're going to make a variable for our last name. And we can make that Smith. And then we're going to make a function to try to get the full name. And we're just going to return a string, and we're going to say return, and we have to do some string interpolation here, right? To sort of inject these values into our string. This should be a familiar concept to you. And we're going to say first name space middle name space last name. Okay, so let's go ahead and call this function and see what happens. Run your code. And we see that we get back John nil Smith. And that's really ugly, and we would never want that to show up in a real life app or program, but it is working as expected. So because middle name is optional and it doesn't have a value, the compiler processes that as nil. And we would never want to say, hi, John nil Smith, right? So what we have to do is unwrap this property. And we're going to do or use a default value to accomplish that. So I'm going to go ahead and create another property called middle unwrapped. And we are going to say it's equal to middle name. And the way you supply something with a default value is use 2 question marks and then say like default value for now. This is obviously just for testing purposes to show you guys what this is going to do. And then let's replace middle name with middle unwrapped. And let's run our code again. And you see that it's now John default value Smith, right? And that's obviously not what we want. This is just to show you how the default value stuff works. So basically this is saying that if middle name doesn't have a value, I'm always just going to default to this value that you're giving me. And this is a string, so it's all working fine. Like we can't go here and give it a default value of 0, right? Because it's a string and then we're trying to give it a default value of an integer. So what we actually want to do here, guys, is just make this a blank string, okay? So it's literally not going to append anything to this return statement. It's just going to be a blank set of quotes. If you made it a space on accident, it would put an extra space in there, which looks weird. So we're just going to make that a blank string. So it literally just does nothing if it's not there, right? Which is what we want. Hi, John Smith. But if we do give it a middle name, John Alex Smith, and then call this function again, so now middle name has a value, it's going to be John Alex Smith, and it's not going to have that nasty optional wrapper inside there. It's just going to say Alex. And the reason it's safely unwrapped is because we have supplied it with the default value. So our compiler knows that if it's ever not there, if it's ever equal to nil, it always has something to default to. So that's how you unwrap stuff with default values. So you could also use an if-let statement to do this. And you guys might be like, okay, well, when do I use one versus the other? And it's really personal preference. So if-lets are acceptable here, default values are acceptable here. It really just boils down to what you want to do and what you're more comfortable with. There's a lot of different options we have, and that can make things a little overwhelming, but it's also good to have those options so that if one makes more sense to you than the other, you can go ahead and use that. We are going to go over one more example with how to unwrap optional values. And it's going to be using something called a guard statement. So let's go ahead and make another section for that and do one more example before we finish up this module. So we're going to say mark guard statements. So let's go back to this form, guys. Let's imagine that, we have this form in an application, and once the user fills it out, we want to send some sort of confirmation text message to them, right? So the only problem is we're not forcing them to input this phone number. It's an optional field. So let's go ahead and see how we would write a program or function to safely do this and handle the case for when the phone number isn't there and handle it for when it is. And we're going to use a guard statement to do that. So basically, let's create two properties. We're going to create an email property and set test@gmail.com, and then a phone number property. So we can see here that the email property is required. So we're just giving that a value, right? But the phone number property is optional. So we're going to write a function to say func send confirmation. And it's going to either send it to the email or the phone number. Okay, so basically the logic behind this is we're going to say if the phone number is there, send a confirmation text message. If it's not, send a confirmation email, right? This is pretty common for what you would see in this situation. So we're going to use a guard statement to do that. We're going to say guard let number equal phone number, else return, okay? So I know this might be a little confusing. We're going to go over it in just a second. Then we're going to say print send confirmation to number. Or we could say send text confirmation or something, right? And let's go ahead and say send confirmation. And if we run our code, absolutely nothing is going to happen. So why is that? So I want to talk a little bit about this guard statement that we see here, what it's doing, what it means, and how it's different than an if-let statement. So basically, guys, when we used our if-let, this is basically going to say, hey, go down this path if this thing has a value, and then you can safely use that unwrapped value. It's the idea of going down a path if a certain condition is met, right? Well, a guard statement is much less like a path, and it's much more like a wall. So it's basically going to say, hey, if the number's not there, we're going to stop right here. You have hit a wall. This function will stop its execution right here on line 62. So we could say print, check this out. We could say print did call function or something. Run that. And we'll see here that we called the function, right? So that print statement is executing. But it hits this line on 63, and because phone number is nil in this case, it returns. It stops right there. That's what the return means in this case. So it's basically saying, make sure the phone number's there, else, or if not, stop and return. And it's important to note that anytime we say return in a function, that is equivalent to stopping the function right there in its tracks, or like hitting a wall, so to speak. And we're used to seeing return and seeing like a return value. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But because this function isn't returning anything, we can just say return here. It doesn't return anything, and it just stops the function right there. So this really showcases the difference between if-let and guard-lets. Guards are like a wall that the program hits if the condition is not met. In this case, phone number has to have a value, and if it does, it gets stored in this number property. Then we can continue on with the rest of our function and use that property safely because we know it's there. And if it's not, it stops right here. Whereas an if-let statement goes down a particular path, right? So everything else has to go, like to use this property, you have to be within this path or this block of code in order to use that. Whereas with the guard guy, we can just continue on the function regularly because we're using a wall instead of a path. That's how I sort of like to think about it. So we can also put code in this else block, guys. So if you remember the original requirements of what we were talking about, we say, hey, if the phone number's there, then I want to send a text confirmation, but if it's not, I want to send an email confirmation. So this is the case for when it's not there. So just hit delete that return statement for now and hit enter here. And then we could say print send email confirmation to the email address. And we always have to say return. That's the nature of a guard statement. The else block that we see here has to return because that's like how the guard statement is going to work, okay? So now we can run our code again, and we're going to get this print statement here. This means the phone number did not have a value, so we entered into this else block and the function stopped right there. You guys can see that we never print out this send text confirmation to email. Once again, that is because it stopped the execution at line when it did this guard statement check. And we're just going to go ahead and send the email confirmation. But I'm sure you guys can imagine that if we set phone number and give it a value, 555, 555, 5555, and then call send confirmation again and run our code, then it's not going to say, hey, send an email confirmation. It's going to say send a text confirmation to 555, blah, 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 blah. Another way of doing this, guys, would be to say if let phone number equals phone number and else send email. So we could just say send email, send text, right? So this is just another way of accomplishing the same thing, same, but different. So you guys might naturally now be asking, okay, well, when do I use one versus the other? So before we end this module, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some different situations in which you might want to use guard statements versus if statements versus default values. And we will also get a lot more practice with this once we start building applications and, have different situations in which we can apply these concepts. So a big reason I like to use guard statements over if let statements some of the time is that if let statements can, one, get really messy. So you guys might imagine that if you had like 10 properties you needed to unwrap and check, and if you had multiple if let statements, your code would start to look like this: if let, if let, if let. Right? And then you start to get this really nasty like pyramid of brackets, and that makes your code really hard to read and really hard to understand what's going on because of all those like different pathways that you're going down and all of those nasty brackets that you have. So guard statements allow you to avoid that by, keeping your code in line, so to speak, where you don't have to open up a set of brackets and go down a path. You can just set up walls that your program will hit if those conditions aren't met. But there are certain situations where you would want to use if let statements as well. Like sometimes you don't want that wall there, right? Sometimes you want to just say, hey, go down this path if necessary. And if you don't have to go down that path, that's fine. But I want you to continue the execution of the program, right? So guard statements will stop you in your tracks if the condition isn't met, whereas you can continue the execution of a program with an if let statement if you want to. So that's sort of, some different situations that might occur with guard and if let statements, but it really boils down to personal preference, guys. There's nothing you can't accomplish with one versus the other. It's just a different way of accomplishing the same thing. And it's nice to have those options available to us. And with default values, like in this example, you wouldn't want to give someone a phone number with a default value, right? Like the user has to provide that value. So you might not want to use a default value there. But in this example, it's perfectly acceptable, right? Because we could just make the middle name an empty string. So each thing has its own time and place. And like I said, once we do more examples with this stuff, we'll get much more practice with it and a better understanding of it. But the goal of this video was to showcase optional properties and how they work, guys. And I think we've done a really good job of that here. We can see how optional properties work and what their use cases are, and we have a bunch of different options of unwrapping them in order to use them safely. And this is going to make our life a lot easier when we're working with properties that may or may not have a value. So that's going to wrap it up for this module. In the next one, the final module of this course, before we get on to some really awesome app development stuff, is going to be looking at classes. And then that's the final module. Then we're going to do a bunch of practice problems just to work our programming muscles before we really get into the fun stuff with app development, guys. So get excited. We'll see you there. Peace.